It was a sweltering summer afternoon, the kind of day where the heat radiated off the ground and the air felt thick with humidity. The sound of water splashing and laughter echoed across the popular lake, a brief escape from the oppressive heat for anyone lucky enough to be near its cool waters. On the worn-out docks by the shore, Daniel, a 15-year-old black teen, sat with his friends, their skin glistening with sweat, their clothes ragged but their spirits high. They were a small group, a tight-knit crew of kids who knew the struggles of their neighborhood, and yet always seemed to find joy in each other's company. The world outside, with its judgments and expectations, felt miles away when they were together. Daniel leaned back on the dock, his worn sneakers dangling just inches above the water. His friends were tossing a frisbee, laughing at each other's jokes, teasing one another in the way only close friends can. Despite the financial struggles of his family, his single mother working long hours, and their small apartment with peeling paint, Daniel never let it weigh him down. He found peace in these moments of simple joy, surrounded by the people who mattered most. There was no pressure here, no expectations, just freedom. But that peace was short-lived. Across the lake, the rumbling of a car engine cut through the air, and Daniel's gaze shifted. A convoy of flashy cars pulled up to the lake's entrance, gleaming in the sunlight. The vehicles, all high-end models, were far removed from the rusted bikes and beat-up cars most people in Daniel's neighborhood used. The door slammed open, and out stepped a group of teenagers, well-dressed, laughing, and unmistakably wealthy. Among them was Sarah, the daughter of a millionaire, dressed in an expensive swimsuit that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop of the lake. Her blonde hair shimmered under the sun, and her bright smile reflected an image of someone who had never known the hardships of life. She was the embodiment of everything Daniel's neighborhood wasn't, and everything it was often told it could never be. As Sarah and her friends made their way toward the water, their laughter filled the air, a sound that, at first, didn't seem to belong in such a humble setting. Daniel watched them curiously, the contrast between his world and theirs, striking in its sharpness. They were here for fun, but they didn't belong here, not really. Sarah, in particular, seemed out of place, nervously glancing around, unsure of what she was doing in this unfamiliar environment. "I don't know, guys," Sarah hesitated, eyeing the water. "I don't really know how to swim." Her friends, unimpressed by her reluctance, rolled their eyes and snickered. "Come on, Sarah, stop being such a baby," one of them taunted, giving her a playful shove toward the edge of the water. "It's just a little lake. You're not scared of some water, are you?" Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment as her friends laughed and pushed her further. They were a perfect picture of privilege, confident, mocking, and completely unaware of how their words and actions affected those around them. Sarah, however, was clearly uncomfortable. The mocking laughter of her friends echoed around her, the weight of their expectations hanging heavy on her shoulders. "You're so scared of a little water," one of them continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You should be embarrassed." The pressure was palpable. Sarah looked around, her cheeks burning as she saw Daniel and his friends watching from across the water. She felt the sting of their judgment. Was she too scared to swim? Was she too weak to handle the challenge? In a moment of quiet defiance, she straightened her back, though her voice trembled slightly as she snapped, "Fine, I'll show you. I'll swim out there." Her friends cheered, laughing loudly, their mockery only intensifying the pressure on Sarah. They didn't care about her fear. They cared about pushing her to prove something they would probably forget about in an hour. But it was everything to Sarah right now. Daniel watched the interaction quietly, noticing the way Sarah's posture shifted as she tried to pretend she wasn't afraid. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her hands as they clutched the edge of the dock. She wasn't ready for this, but the pressure from her friends was too much to resist. With one last glance toward her friends, Sarah stepped into the water, her movements tentative and uncertain. Her friends continued to jeer, egging her on as she hesitated at the water's edge. And despite the confident facade she tried to maintain, Daniel could see her fear. He saw it in the way she hesitated before taking her first step into the deeper water, the way her body stiffened as she waded out further than she was comfortable with. The lake, though calm at first, held its own dangers, especially for someone who wasn't used to it. The deeper waters, now pulling at Sarah's legs, began to challenge her in ways she wasn't prepared for. But instead of slowing down, she pushed herself further, determined to prove something she didn't need to prove. Sarah pushed herself further out into the lake, her movements initially hesitant, but soon gaining confidence. The cool water lapped at her legs, but as she ventured deeper, the current started to change. What seemed like a harmless dip turned into a challenge, as the water tugged at her limbs. At first, she wasn't worried. She'd grown up surrounded by wealth and comfort, and her life had rarely been a challenge. But as the water reached her chest and her feet could no longer touch the bottom, she began to panic. The current was stronger than she had anticipated. Her breaths became ragged, and her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to keep herself afloat. She kicked harder, but the water just kept pulling her under. The surface seemed farther away with each passing second. She shouted for help, but her voice was swallowed by the splashes of water and the laughter of her friends. They were too busy teasing her, egging her on to dive in deeper. They didn't notice her struggle. "Sarah, what's wrong?" one of her friends called, but the words were drowned out by the rush of water around her. She felt her legs grow weak, the current more forceful with each passing second. The terror that she was losing control gripped her chest, her vision blurring as the water began to rise above her head. Panic set in. She was drowning, and no one seemed to care. Meanwhile, on the shore, Daniel was trying to enjoy his afternoon, hanging out with his friends. He had always loved the quiet moments by the lake, the simplicity of the world around him. But everything changed when he heard Sarah's cry for help. His head snapped toward the water, his heart suddenly racing. He knew that voice. Daniel's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the edge of the lake, his friends calling after him, but he didn't stop. He dove into the water without hesitation. The coldness hit him instantly, but he pushed through it, swimming with urgency. His heart pounded as he saw Sarah, her head barely above the surface, her arms flailing weakly. Every stroke was a battle against the current, which seemed to grow stronger as he neared her. Sarah's frantic gasps for air only fueled his determination. He could see her fear now, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't just struggling, she was fighting to stay alive. "Sarah!" Daniel called out, but his voice was lost in the crashing waves. His arms and legs burned as he pushed forward, cutting through the water with everything he had. When he reached her, Sarah was barely moving, her body sinking. Without wasting a moment, Daniel grabbed her, his hands slipping slightly on her wet skin. Her eyes locked with his for a brief second, filled with panic, confusion, and fear. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled her toward him, keeping his grip tight as the water tried to drag them both under. The current was relentless, and every stroke he took felt like a fight against fate itself. He knew he had to get her out. He had to save her. The coldness of the water seeped deep into his bones, and his muscles screamed for relief, but there was no time for weakness. His mind stayed focused on one thing: getting Sarah to safety. With every ounce of strength, he pulled her through the water, inch by agonizing inch. The shore felt impossibly far, but Daniel didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the shallow water. Daniel's legs gave out, his body collapsing onto the soft mud of the lake bed. But he didn't care. Sarah was alive. He pulled her gently to the shore, gasping for air as the crowd on the bank began to move. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, but she was breathing. She was alive. Daniel collapsed beside her, his hands shaking, his body trembling from the effort. He had done it. He had saved her. Daniel finally managed to pull Sarah to safety, her limp body resting on the shore. His chest heaved with each ragged breath, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. His hands, still shaking, hovered over her, checking for any sign of life. His heart was racing as he watched her chest rise and fall, the subtle movements giving him the faintest sense of relief. She was breathing, alive. But just as Daniel allowed himself a moment of respite, the crowd around them started to stir. The wealthy onlookers, mostly Sarah's friends and their families, had gathered in a tight, confused circle. Some stood back, phones raised, filming every moment, while others lingered, unsure of how to respond. It was as if they were waiting for some sort of explanation, something that made sense of the scene they had just witnessed. One of Sarah's friends, a tall, well-dressed man, squinted at Daniel, his face twisted in skepticism. "What's this kid doing here?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "He shouldn't even be near the water. What if he made things worse?" His words cut through the air, louder than any of the gentle murmurs of concern from the crowd. Another woman in the group, who had been standing quietly on the edge, whispered to her friend, her eyes locked on Daniel. "Can you believe it? He's a poor black kid from the slums. Why did he even think he could help?" The shock of witnessing Sarah's near drowning quickly faded into discomfort and judgment. The mocking began, soft at first, like a subtle undercurrent, but it grew louder, more venomous with each passing moment. Sarah's friends, once worried for her, now started questioning Daniel's motives. They couldn't fathom why someone like him would risk his life for someone like Sarah. Maybe he just wanted to look like a hero, one of Sarah's friends muttered, her voice laced with sarcasm. "What's he trying to prove?" The hateful whispers filtered through the crowd, and Daniel felt every word like a punch to the gut. He was still crouched beside Sarah, his hands still clutching her, trying to keep her safe. But now, the attacks were no longer coming from the water. They were coming from the people standing around him. One of Sarah's friends, a tall blonde girl with an air of superiority, crossed her arms and looked at Daniel with a mix of curiosity and distaste. "Why is he even here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "Shouldn't he be somewhere else, like at home?" Daniel's stomach twisted at her words, his throat tightening. They didn't see him as a hero. They didn't see him as someone who had just saved a life. They saw him only for his skin color, his background. They didn't care that he had risked his life to pull Sarah from the lake. To them, he was just a poor black kid who didn't belong. "Probably doesn't even know how to swim himself," another girl added, her voice dripping with condescension, as if his actions could somehow be invalidated by his race. Daniel's heart sank as the weight of their words pressed down on him. Each comment, each laugh, each sneer was like a physical blow. His body ached with exhaustion from the physical toll of saving Sarah, but the emotional weight of the mocking felt heavier. Still crouching by Sarah, Daniel lowered his head. He could feel his cheeks burning, not from the heat of the sun, but from the sting of their words. Racism, in this moment, cut deeper than any physical injury ever could. He had saved Sarah, risked everything, and yet all they saw was a black kid from the wrong side of town. His thoughts swirled in confusion. Should he stand up to them, call them out, let them know what he had done? Or should he walk away, pretend their words didn't hurt? The decision was difficult, the weight of the situation too overwhelming for him to process. But as he looked down at Sarah, still unconscious but breathing, his resolve solidified. She was alive. That was what mattered. But as Daniel stayed by her side, the mocking voices continued to echo in his mind. No matter what he did, no matter how much he had given to save her, he knew there were people who would never see him for the hero he was. He swallowed hard, trying to shake the bitter sting of their prejudice, but deep down he knew something the crowd didn't. Their judgment didn't define him. It couldn't. The sound of a luxury car pulling up broke the tense silence. The engine cut off abruptly, and from the gleaming vehicle stepped a tall, commanding figure. It was Sarah's father, John Davis, the millionaire businessman. His sharp suit, immaculately pressed, contrasted with the dusty surroundings, his demeanor exuding authority and control. But his expression, when his eyes fell on his daughter lying on the ground, was one of pure concern. He rushed to her side in an instant, his eyes frantically scanning her body for injuries. His hands hovered over her, checking for signs of life, and his deep breath of relief when he felt her chest rise and fall was almost audible. He whispered her name softly, brushing a lock of her hair from her forehead. "Sarah, baby, are you okay?" he said, his voice thick with worry. Sarah's eyelids fluttered open, her eyes meeting her father's as he gently cradled her head. She let out a weak groan, barely conscious but alive, and John's heart visibly softened as he held her close. His gaze moved down to her, now conscious, as he held her in his arms, but his expression soon turned to the boy still kneeling in the mud. Daniel was covered in soot, exhausted, and shaking from his efforts to save Sarah. He remained silent, still on his knees, looking up at Sarah's father. As John's eyes landed on him, there was a brief flicker of confusion, but then something else replaced it, something that Daniel hadn't expected: gratitude. The crowd had fallen into a heavy silence. The moment Sarah's father arrived, the air shifted. It wasn't just the wealth and power he carried. It was the sincerity in his eyes, the visible relief in his voice as he looked at his daughter. And then his gaze turned to Daniel. John took a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, his words carrying weight as they pierced through the crowd's murmur. "You didn't hesitate. You did what no one else would." The words hung in the air like a lifeline, a sharp contrast to the harsh words and judgment that had been cast upon Daniel just moments ago. John's voice grew stronger as he addressed the crowd, now watching in stunned silence. "Why are you questioning him? He's a hero." His words were commanding, and the crowd shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their phones as if the act of filming had lost its significance in light of the truth. Embarrassment rippled through the onlookers, but the damage had already been done. The judgment of Daniel, fueled by his race, still lingered in the background. John turned back to Daniel, his face softening. His eyes, once filled with concern for his daughter, now reflected something deeper: respect and gratitude. "You've proven what kind of person you are," John continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "I owe you everything." Daniel's heart pounded as he looked up at the man who, until moments ago, had been a stranger. This wasn't just an act of gratitude. It was a recognition of Daniel's worth, of his humanity, something he'd never been given before. John pulled out his wallet, his hands steady despite the emotion filling him. He scribbled something on a check and held it out to Daniel. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll make sure you get everything you deserve. You'll have the future you've always dreamed of. I'll help you get an education and take care of your family." Daniel's eyes widened as he looked at the check, his hands shaking. The weight of the moment crashed over him. He had saved Sarah. He had done something no one expected of him, and now this man, this millionaire, was offering him a chance to build the life he had always hoped for. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. All he could do was stare at the check, at the promise of something better, something more than he had ever imagined. But despite the shock, Daniel knew this wasn't just about the money. It was about being seen, about being valued. It was about a future, his future, finally within his grasp. The crowd, now silent, watched as Daniel took the check from John's hand, still unsure whether this was real. But for Daniel, this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to escape the judgments and limitations of his past, to prove that kindness and courage could create a future worth fighting for. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's life began to shift in ways he had never imagined. With Sarah's father's sponsorship, Daniel was enrolled in a prestigious school, an opportunity that seemed like a dream. He stood out among his peers, not just because of his background, but because of the way he embraced his new world, his hunger for knowledge, his determination to rise above the circumstances he had been born into. The mocking voices of that day still lingered in the back of his mind, a quiet reminder of the prejudices he had faced, but now they had less power over him. He had something far more powerful than their judgment: hope. And for the first time, Daniel felt as though his future was full of possibility. His days were no longer defined by the struggles of the past. Instead, they were filled with new experiences, new challenges, and, above all, a sense of purpose. He threw himself into his studies, knowing that each step he took was one closer to the future he had always dreamed of. The school was tough, filled with students who didn't understand where he came from, who saw him as different, but Daniel's resolve was unwavering. He had a chance now, a real chance, and he wasn't about to let anything stand in his way. It was the day of his graduation when the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice finally came to fruition. The ceremony was filled with applause, the air buzzing with excitement. Daniel, now a young man, walked confidently across the stage, his heart swelling with pride. The crowd cheered as he accepted his diploma, and his eyes scanned the sea of faces in the audience. There, near the front, was Sarah's father, his proud smile unmistakable. The man who had given Daniel the opportunity to change his life. The man who had seen him for who he truly was, someone with potential, with the strength to overcome, despite the odds stacked against him. Daniel stood tall, his heart racing as he gazed out at the crowd. He had done it. He had achieved what so many believed was impossible. He had risen above the prejudices, the stereotypes, and the doubt. He had carved out a path for himself, not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who had triumphed over adversity. And as he stood there, accepting his achievement, he knew that his journey had only just begun. In the audience, Sarah stood with a proud smile on her face. She had watched Daniel grow from the boy who had saved her life into the young man who had shaped his own destiny. Their friendship had deepened over the years, forged in the fires of that fateful day by the lake. She remembered the boy who had risked everything to save her, who had faced a crowd full of mockery and doubt. Now, as she looked at him, she saw the embodiment of strength, of courage, and of the unwavering belief that anyone, no matter their background, could change their fate. Sarah's eyes filled with pride as she watched Daniel take his place among the graduates. She remembered the boy who, despite the racism, the mockery, and the harshness of the world, had proven everyone wrong. He had shown the world that he was more than just a stereotype. He was a hero, a young man with the courage to change his life, and in doing so, change the world around him. As the applause echoed around the room, Daniel's heart swelled with gratitude. This moment, this triumph, wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had supported him, who had seen him for who he truly was, and who had helped him break free from the constraints of his past. His future was bright, filled with endless possibilities. And he knew, deep down, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would continue to rise. He would continue to prove that his worth wasn't defined by the color of his skin, but by the strength of his character.